All
Um,
right.
Good
Yeah, well,
morning,
welcome
everybody.
good morning everyone. Welcome to our Getting Curious About Anger workshop. Today, I think now that we've got all the technical difficulties figured out, I think it's going to be good. So, if we just start here at Heartwood, we just like to start with a land honoring. So, with gratitude, humility, and respect, we recognize and honor that Heartwood Healing Center offices are located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Innu, Achiti, Sakowin, and on the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. We recognize the historical and ongoing violence of colonization, respect the original treaties made to live respectfully and in harmony on this land, and commit to working towards reconciliation. As a place for healing, we're committed to walking with those with whom we're privileged to work and understand that Indigenous peoples have been traumatized mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually as a result of colonization. We commit to unlearning and learning, to building alignment with the truth and the TRC's call to action, the 2SMMIWG calls to justice, UNDRIP, and working towards uncolonization and anti-oppressive practice within our organization.
Thank you, Jay, for starting us off with a land honoring today. I'll share our agenda so you know what to expect for today. We plan to take about an hour. So technically we have you scheduled until 12:30, but we're probably going to be wrapping up around 12, just depending on how things go. We'll start with some introductions of Jay and myself and go over some guidelines for this webinar today. We're then going to talk about
Sorry.
anger within the context of being an emotion, what that means to us, some beliefs about anger that might shape how we view it, trauma responses and the fight response in the context of anger. And then we'll move on to responding to anger and coping. We'll talk about anger and purpose, and then we'll have some conclusions and takeaways, including a self-reflection activity. So that's something where if you want, you can take a moment to jot something down. So you might want to have a pen and paper handy, but it's also something you can just reflect on in the moment we take for that activity. So that's our agenda.
So moving on to introductions, I guess I'll go first. So my name is Jay Kampang. I use they, them pronouns. And I am a student here at Hartwood. So I have the unbelievable privilege to be able to work with the whole team here. I'm currently completing my Bachelor of Social Work program. I graduate in June, so very exciting. Um, and I'm doing my placement here, my second placement here at Hartwood in the short term therapy program.
And my name is Kathryn. I use she, her pronouns. I've been a long-term therapist here at Hartwood for the last 5 years. I've done a couple webinars which are available on our website, but this is the first one we've done with Microsoft Teams. So I appreciate everyone's patience today as Jay and I take a moment to figure it out. But I'm really excited to be here and share some of this with you today.
So moving on to just a few webinar guidelines that will kind of guide us through this morning. So just so everyone is aware, all the participants in this webinar are anonymous. So we don't know who's attending, and folks that are attending.
So I'm just going to pause and say, I think Jay's computer has frozen. Is
Or
that true?
throughout the webinar.
Okay,
Um,
Jay, I'll just let you know that your computer froze. So I'm wondering if you can just read the last one again.
oh no. Okay, yeah. So going back. So as I was mentioning, webinar guidelines that'll kind of guide us throughout this morning. So just so everyone knows, all participants in the webinar are anonymous. So folks that have joined can't see who else has joined. We ask that everyone respects confidentiality guidelines. So anything that is shared within the webinar or in the chat, or if anyone chooses to share something, that you keep that to yourself and not share that outside of the webinar. We also encourage folks to take care of themselves, take care of if you need breaks, if you need to grab water, or anything like that, totally feel free to do that. And we obviously invite everyone to take what you find helpful from the webinar. Like Kathryn mentioned, you can take notes during the webinar. You can choose to share as much or as little as you want and participate in the activity or not. And of course, at the end, we are welcoming all questions or comments related to the webinar or not. Um, so we'll have the little bit of a discussion period just a little bit later on.
Mhm. All right. So you might be asking yourselves, why anger? Why would we be interested in this as therapists, as people who identify with trauma, people seeking therapy, that kind of thing? And we want to contextualize anger within the context of all emotions. Anger is an emotion just like the other five, and those that fall under those five umbrellas pictured on the screen. Um, and so, anger being an emotion, we want to remind ourselves today that that's different from it being a thought. So, thoughts are mental processes that can typically be described in a sentence, versus feelings are body energy reactions. So, feelings live in our bodies, and we're going to understand them today as body energy reactions. Um, we also consider as therapists that emotions are neutral, they're not specifically good or bad. We want to use this today to think a bit about anger as something that's just as valuable as any other emotion. Um, and so, in that sense, us as therapists are certainly interested in anger and what it can tell us. When we think about anger or feelings as body energy reactions, we want to think that they have value because their intention is to help our survival. They provide us reactions in real time to information that might be helpful to our survival. So, for example, if something makes us feel joyful, like as is described there in yellow, then we know it's something good for us. We might think that more of that will actually benefit us. If we think about something that makes us sad, it might be because something happened that we care about. And so it makes sense that we're sad. With anger, anger can often give us a signal that we're experiencing some kind of wrong. And that's incredibly important to our survival. We have emotions because we are not robots. The idea is not that we just go about our days, day to day, and not have any emotional reactions to the things that happen. And so, in that sense, having anger is incredibly valuable. So, one thing to take from this slide is just that anger is an emotion, and all emotions are neutral. They're not specifically good or bad. That being said, we called this webinar Getting Curious About Anger because anger is something that often we shy away from, or we might have a lot of beliefs about. Some of those beliefs or messages that we've received throughout our lives might be that anger is a problem, again, problem in quotes. It might be that anger is dangerous. So the idea that dangerous behavior and harm and anger are the same thing, even though those aren't isn't true. um, we might have experienced that anger is for some people and not others. So we might have gotten the message throughout our life that some people are allowed to be angry and some people are not allowed to be angry. This might have to do with gender, it might have to do with race, it might have to do with age, and these are typically things that people get a sense of very young in their growing up, some impressions about anger. We also want to add here that beliefs about anger are created in society, but they might be present in ourselves, or if they're not present in ourselves, they still might be present in those in our lives. So perhaps our caregivers had these beliefs, or people in our schools, or people in our communities, and we were forced to change our relationship to anger based on those things. So no wonder anger can be uncomfortable.
Moving on a little bit now to different trauma responses. So this is a trauma response is essentially a biological response to our anger. So it means that our nervous system can be triggered into what we call four different states. So we have the fight, the flight, the freeze, and then the fawn. And Kathryn actually found the best diagram for this. So as we can kind of see, we have our fight here in the top left, and that's like the confrontation to the threat. So that can be feelings of anger, of rage, of confrontation, that really like high energy kind of state that we can find ourselves in. Then we have the flight, which is at the top right corner. And the flight, that's when we want to run away from the threat. So that can be our feelings of anxiety, of panic, avoidance, and again, that high energy that we need to flee something, that we're in danger. At the bottom left, we have the freeze. So that's really the shutdown, the complete lockout to the threat. And in that kind of state, we can experience emotions such as like dissociation, numbness, complete shutdown, and really low energy. And then we have the fawn response, which is often not as often talked about, actually. But fawn is when we actually appease the threat. So that can be with people pleasing, through codependency, our lack of boundaries, etc. So these states, essentially, these four states are our body's way of responding when we feel threatened or we feel unsafe. And this is when our anger can come up as a way to protect ourselves from what's going on in our environment. So ultimately, understanding how our body responds can help us recognize when we are in fight mode or if we're in any of these other trauma response modes. To continue on to that, we have anger as a protective part. So, anger can actually try to help us by trying to move away from other emotions and distract us from our pain. So, when we think of anger, we actually think of it mainly as a primary emotion, right? So, those kind of core emotions: anger, sadness, happiness. Um, Although this is still true, underneath anger, we often find other primary emotions like hurt and fear and overwhelm. Um, and these emotions often go unrecognized because our anger is kind of taking over um, that kind of that part. So in this sense, we could really say that anger is actually trying to protect us and shield us from feeling the more vulnerable emotions that are underneath. So we have this little diagram here of the anger iceberg. So the top is this big iceberg, the angry. So those are the large pieces of ice that are floating around in the open ocean. So sometimes what we can see at the surface may not be exactly what's happening and what's hidden below the water. And that's kind of how our anger works, right? We have anger that's coming up at the surface, and then underneath that, we have all of those other emotions that are often hidden underneath that big iceberg.
Oh, thanks, Jay. We want to talk a little bit now about responses and coping. And I'm just going to start by reading the part in the middle there where it says, while it's important to cope with the anger in our bodies, once we're more grounded, we can reflect on why we became angry in the first place and see our experience as valid. So, we're bringing forward two ideas today. One is that anger exists in the body, which means that we need a body type response to anger in order to ground ourselves. We're bringing that up, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, how we can cope with anger in that sense. And then separately, we're talking about how that anger does contain a message for us, and that message is valuable no matter what. So, earlier, when Jay was talking a little bit about trauma responses, Jay talked about how, with that fight response, it's when our bodies have determined that there's some kind of threat. It could be a trauma trigger, or it could be just a stressor or something that puts ourselves on alert. And with that fight response, it's where we try to protect ourselves through an increase in energy. So through mobilizing or moving. So we might experience things like an influx of adrenaline and cortisol, because energy is an emotion that has a lot of, or anger is an emotion that has a lot of energy associated with it. People typically don't feel like, I'm so angry I could just fall asleep. That's typically not how we experience anger, and we know that intuitively. Um, but when we have that experience of anger, whether it's a trauma trigger or not, um, we often feel this influx again of energizing hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. But once the problem is solved, or we get away from the threat, or we move on with our day in some ways, that body response still requires some care. It still requires some way to cope. So even if we've gotten away from whatever it was that caused our anger, we still might have a body experience of anger that needs some release. So, for example, if you are feeling that ways to cope with anger are things that typically use some of that energy that our body has so brilliantly created for us through anger. So, some ways to cope with anger, and here I mean releasing the energy that anger gives us, could be exercising in some sort of way, even just standing up from wherever we are and walking around the room, or going up to do something in another room, or more intensive exercise. It could be tension and release exercises. So, maybe with a therapist or on your own, you've heard of progressive muscle relaxation. And if you haven't, that's absolutely okay. It can be something to look up another time. But with progressive muscle relaxation, it's a process of tensing our muscles on purpose. So, maybe something like making a fist and then releasing it, making a fist and then releasing it. And through this, we use some of that energy and can experience more grounding and release after that. It could be things like screaming into a pillow, so using our voice in that way, or just screaming without the pillow if you're a space in which that would be okay. But this can release some of that verbally. It could be something like singing or dancing along to music. Again, this uses our body through our singing, through our dancing, in order to release some of that. And again, the music of choice might really help you cope. And then some other things could include something like journaling out those feelings and using that written expression as a way of releasing that energy that was created through the anger. So, as we look at this, notice that we're focusing on the anger as a body experience here, and how to deal with that in our bodies. But what we're really highlighting too is that, again, while it's important to cope with the anger in our bodies, once we've done that exercise, or we've screamed into a pillow or journaled or whatever, and we feel maybe a little bit more grounded, we feel a little bit calmer, we can reflect on why we became angry in the first place and see our experience as valid. And I'm going to give a really small example here. Just something quite low key, I would say. But sometimes if I'm a pedestrian and I'm crossing the street at a crosswalk and someone cuts me off in their vehicle, I notice this experience of anger come up. I noticed this experience of anger come up, and it feels really yucky and all that. And in terms of what I notice in my body is things like, again, that higher energy response. So I might be walking quicker. All of a sudden, I'm like bristling along. I'm walking quicker. I have more of that energy because I'm angry now. I often get tense in my eyebrows. So I feel all this tension right here. Again, that's tense. There's a lot of energy there, and I'm like, oh, blah, 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 blah. And it's great to enact that out. It's great to walk it off or think about something else as we just kind of release it. Um, but then it's also important to notice that, why did we become angry in the first place? That experience is valid. So being able to walk safely down the street is an experience that's important to me, or to cross, I guess, at a crosswalk. And so, um, through that anger, I noticed that message of the message is that's wrong. That's wrong. Because like we said earlier, as I experience the world, I'm not a robot. I have this anger response for a reason. And it shows that I care about safe streets and safe driving. And so maybe next time, if I'm, for example, the one in the car driving, um, it reminds me of that value that I don't want to cut off pedestrians. I want pedestrians to be safe. And so through that example, anger reminds me um, that that there is some justification here and that this is a problem that matters to me. It's a message that some wrong has occurred. Even though, so on one hand, we can talk about the response in my body, again, walking fast, feeling high energy, all the tension in my forehead, and then also the reason why I feel that way, that experience is valid and has a message for me. All right, thanks, Jay. Okay, so we are going to move to doing a brief activity about this. And I provided that example of walking down the street as a example for this activity. So we're going to take a couple minutes and I'll invite everyone, if they want, to pull out a pen and paper and reflect on some of these questions. So we have a couple questions for reflection. So what situations get me angry? And you might want to think of something that's not too intense. So like a small example of anger, maybe something that feels similar to my example of being cut off as I cross the street. See if you can think of one of those and maybe write it down. And then whenever you've done that, feel free to then reflect, where and how do I feel the anger in my body? If you need to take a moment and really picture that situation in order to feel more in touch with how you might feel that anger in your body, feel free to do so. I know in my example, I talked about the anger, I suppose, was in my legs, in feeling high energy and wanting to walk faster. The energy was also in that tension between my eyebrows, tension in my forehead. There's that anger. And if you've done that, maybe add here some descriptors. So you might want to jot down, is that anger feel warm or cold? Does it feel tense or relaxed? Does it feel fast or slow? Loud or soft? Heavy or light? Take a moment to just write those down. And again, we're just practicing using a small example, something that applies to your life in the here and now. Jay, I'm wondering if you want to give an example, not to put you on the spot.
Yeah. I could share an example. Something actually that made me really angry yesterday. It might seem a little bit silly, but um, I burnt my tongue pretty bad when I was eating. I was warming something up to eat, and I guess I heated it too fast and or too for too long in the microwave. and I burnt my tongue. And that made me really angry.
Mhm.
So for me, in that moment, I felt my anger in my body, almost like in my throat, again in my eyebrows, the kind of frowning, really like in my head, like really in the front of my forehead as well. And for me, my anger was warm, so I felt hot, like the where kind of my chest area is, felt really hot. I was really tense because I was upset that I had burnt my tongue.
Mhm.
And the anger was quite fast just because I had that initial reaction of burning myself. But I also kind of flung my spoon on the table. So in that sense, it was quite loud.
Mhm.
Um, and that anger felt heavy for a little while, because I had to wait for my food to cool down, and I was also
Mhm.
in a rush. And so all of that kind of accumulated together, the fact that I needed to eat to nourish myself, but I also needed to get somewhere on time. And now I had an extra barrier in waiting for my food to cool down a little bit.
Mhm.
And the fact that I burnt my tongue, it was like all of these little layers, that kind of added on that made me really upset in
Mhm.
the moment.
Mhm.
But looking back at that now, a day later, um, I realized that, my anger did have a place. Obviously, I didn't want to burn my mouth, and now I have like a little sore on my tongue, which is quite unfortunate. And my reaction was justified because, burning myself and then kind of flinging my spoon, it was the shock
Mhm.
of that happening to me. But ultimately, it really makes me reflect, on the fact that maybe I just need to slow down a little bit.
Mhm.
Although I have a lot of things in my day, a lot of things keeping me busy, I also need to take, more intentional time for myself to take care of myself, to eat, to shower, to rest properly. And by doing those things, I will feel better and hopefully not, overcook my food.
Jay, I loved that example because you did exactly the next part of this, which is to think about what is the survival role in you being angry. And I'm wondering if we can go back to that slide just for 1 second. So
Sure.
you were able to put together the survival role in you being angry. It's that you care about not burning your tongue. That's important. And you also care about eating some food, and you know that needs to happen for you to nourish yourself throughout your day, no matter what else is going on. And so it really brought that up. I noticing in the meeting chat somebody brought up an example, and I would invite if anybody else wants to do the same, please feel free to do so. I'm just going to read this example out loud. So somebody had commented, I feel angry when there is so much traffic on the roads and I need to get somewhere. I feel it as hot and explosive, wanting to explode out of my body, especially my hands and arms. What a great descriptor, the body
Mhm.
areas and also the descriptions of those sensations. That's awesome. I also want to say why we included this activity. So, if you remember back to one of the earlier slides when we were talking about beliefs about anger, so common beliefs, one of those beliefs is that anger is bad. Just straight up, anger is bad or wrong or dangerous. And if we only describe anger in those terms to ourselves, we're only going to further that belief. We're only going to make that belief stronger in us. And then we're going to avoid anger even more. Versus in terms of being curious about anger, what we're doing today is practicing using different terms to describe that anger so that we can acknowledge it without judgment. So, again, going back, what we're doing here, instead of perpetuating that belief of anger is wrong, or even something like, I can't be angry, that might be a belief that we have. Um, that's not acceptable to me. That's certainly one that I have experienced from time to time. But rather than those types of things, today with this activity, we are practicing noticing it more without judgment. So, again, we're talking about things, we're talking about anger in the body, in terms of Again, some neutral terms could be things like, is it warm or cold, tense or relaxed? And we wanted to give the whole group today some practice in doing that, some practice to notice your anger in a day-to-day situation without worrying about if it's good or bad. You'll notice in Jay's example, they weren't talking about judging themselves for that anger. It was just, again, some of the sensations like tension in the throat, all of that kind of thing. And similarly in the chat, this example, talking about the anger as hot and explosive, the areas of hands and arms, that's great. We're going to read another comment here. Again, we have some time for this. So if anybody else wants to contribute their examples, I'll read this next one. So someone had typed, I feel angry when people run into me when I'm sitting on the bus with their backpacks. Yes, very relatable. I feel it in my face. I get hot and tense and pull into myself. Talk about a protective response. Thank you so much for sharing that. You described the situation, people running into you, hitting you in the face with the backpack when they're in the aisle and you're in a seat. That's what I picture anyway. You feel it in your face, getting hot and tense and pulling into yourself. Great descriptions of that body experience. So
I'm
the
really
next,
glad that, oh, sorry.
no, go ahead, Jay. What are
I
you
was going to
thinking?
say, I'm really glad that you can see the chat because I see nothing.
Okay.
So this is wonderful that at least one of us are on top of it because I love hearing these examples, which are really great descriptors of exactly this, what we're trying to kind of convey here.
Yes. We're going to do a bit of a part 2 to this activity. And again, this is just some extra credit. So if you want to practice this, in a space with a therapist or by yourself, practice noticing this body experience of anger, just like we did today. The second part of this would be able to reflect, and you might want to take a moment to write this down, or you might want to type it in the chat. What is the message behind this anger? What is it that you experience as a wrongdoing? And what does that say about what you care about? So hopefully I can remember how I just said that, but if you've described anger in terms of your body, maybe go ahead and reflect on, what about this experience felt wrong to me? What about this experience felt wrong to me? What does that say about me and what I care about? So if people want to think about that, and again, I see a little bit of typing, and we've got a great comment here. So the person who had typed about the backpacks on the bus example added, it felt wrong to be hit in the face in a supposedly safe spot on the bus. It says I care about myself. That's amazing.
Yes.
What? Yeah. Jay, what do you think of that? Because I just got to read it, but how do you think of
I
that?
think that's great. I'm kind of like over here clapping, like that's a great example. And like also that protective factor that like you are worthy of, having your own space and like having that boundary not be crossed in somewhere where you're supposed to feel safe, right? Like a public place. We would think that being on the bus or being out in public that we would feel safe. And when someone, is kind of hitting us in the face with their backpacks on the bus, I know I've experienced that so many times. It can feel kind of intruding. Um, and that would be something that would make me angry too.
Yeah. Exactly. Jay, oh, totally. What a great example where if you can define, just like this person did, where was the wrong? What about this felt wrong to you? And what does it say about you and what you care about yourself? Um, and going back to when we had that feelings wheel here, and talking about how every emotion has a place, how incredible that this anger was a message that you care about yourself. You care about how your body is treated. You care about if you get hit in the face um, with a backpack on the bus. if you wanted to take this further in your own personal reflections, how does it feel to notice that you care about yourself?
Mhm.
Might want to sit
You
with that.
know, yeah, Catherine, it actually makes me reflect on a little bit of my experience when I was talking about how I burnt my mouth and I was in a rush and that there was all these things happening. And I really think like the underlying kind of value is that I really value being on time. And
Mm,
so the fact that, this situation would maybe make me late made me, I think that was the source of the anger is, oh no, now I'm going to be late
mhm,
for this activity. And how will that look to other people? How will that, what will they think of me for being late?
mhm, mhm,
And that's kind of, being on time is kind of a value that was instilled in me as a young child.
mhm.
Being late is okay sometimes. But for me, that's something that's really important. I don't like being tardy.
Yeah. And again, like how valuable that you can say, you're not a robot. Of course you have these experiences, you care. And so no wonder you feel anger if something compromises your ability to be on time. Yeah. So I just want to break this activity down one more time. Of course, if anybody wants to share anything in the chat about this activity, please feel free to do so. But if you want to use this in your own time to develop a stronger relationship with anger, or I guess a more open relationship with anger, what we're doing here is noticing anger in the body. So finding a situation and describing it in terms of body. So not like, oh, it was terrible, I got angry, but I felt it in my throat, like Jay, or I felt it, in my face, that warmth, like this person who commented. Um, so describing it in terms of the body. And again, that's all about using neutral terms because we're experiencing anger today as a neutral emotion. And then the next part of that, if you want to do it on your own time, just like we said, is reflecting, what does this say about me? Where did I experience wrongdoing in this? What would that say about me and what I care about? And if part of that, like both Jay and the person who commented, if that includes, I care about myself, what does that say? What's that like to experience that you care about yourself? Or if it's about another person and the conclusion you've drawn is, it says, I care about this person in my life. What's it like to notice that? And so that's a way that you can take this activity forward if you ever want to do it again by yourself, with a therapist, with someone else, anything like that. So that will include our activity portion, or conclude our activity portion for today. And thank you, Jay, and participants for all the examples. It's great.
So if we're kind of like building onto our activity, um, noticing our anger, but also seeing that anger does have an underlying purpose. So as Catherine was kind of saying, like our anger has a message for us, right? So it lets us know what's important to us and what feels right or wrong. So I always like to use kind of this example is a sense of injustice. So I know for me, when I see injustice happening either in front of me or in the media or just in the world in general, it makes me really angry. And that has a purpose, right? That energy can actually be a powerful motivator for change and to work harder. So for me, when I see injustice, it makes me angry. But my first thought is not that that anger is a bad emotion, but that that anger actually provides me some power to do something about it. So maybe that's, I know for me, that's like participating in a protest, for example, or looking, at different like legislations or things that I can be a part of to actually mobilize that change, right? So by being curious, essentially, about our anger, it can actually get us be in touch with those underlying emotions and shift our relationship with that anger into something that is not destructive, but something that can actually guide us towards like healing and growth and learning more about ourselves and also about others.
Mhm.
Did you want to add anything to that, Kathryn?
No, I so appreciate how you're bringing this all together. Um, so we have some final tips and takeaways for today, just to summarize. And at this point, I would just invite if anybody has any comments or any questions, you are
Mhm.
welcome to add them into the chat at this time. It could be something about if you want us to talk a little bit more about something we've said today, one of the slides, or it could be, something you agree or disagree with. We'd love to hear that. Or any questions you have, please feel free to post them in the chat just as I share these last points. And I see like the dots that indicate typing. So I'm really excited to hear a little bit of questions or thoughts. Excited for that. But I'll just summarize here that one of the messages for today and the reason we used curious in the title of our webinar is that emotions, including anger, are not good or bad, they're just neutral. They're just information for us. They are an energy response in our body. Um, the next point here is that anger is trying to help us in all the ways that we've described today. And certainly it might not end up helping us if depending on how we use it, right? Some people are using anger in ways that harm others. But the anger, that's focusing then more about the behavior, whereas we're talking about the energy response in our bodies. Anger is trying to help us. That's the intention. So we don't have to judge the intention. It's trying to protect us, like Jay shared with those animals and the fight response. It can try to distract us from pain, like Jay shared with the iceberg example, where maybe the surface emotion is anger, but then underneath it's like, oh, this might feel really hurtful, for example. I'm going to actually piggyback on one of the comments examples to talk a little bit about anger as the iceberg there. So, for example, when the participant talked about feeling angry when people run into them while sitting on the bus with their backpacks. And first, it's the anger for sure. But, and I'm just guessing here, so unsure, but on some level, if you work through the anger, there might be an underlying emotion of feeling like, I'm hurt. I'm hurt physically, and I'm hurt in that I wasn't considered in this. I was ignored. That person with the backpack ignored me. There's something sad about that. And again, that's just a guess, but that might be the emotion underneath that anger. Um, and so it's from trying to distract us from pain in that example. It's trying to tell us something's wrong. Again, from that theme today of we're not robots. It tells us something that's wrong, tells us what we care about, and it gives us motivation. Just like Jay shared, it might motivate you to attend a protest or pay attention to news and legislation about things we care about. That's very motivating. Absolutely. And then the last point here, that anger exists in the body, and we can improve our ability to deal with anger by practicing noticing our bodies and listening to what they need. So, um, again, going back to that idea of when you notice that anger in your body in the moment, you might want to do something for your body to just release some of that anger. You might feel like fidgeting, doing something with your hands. You might feel like getting up and going for a walk. You might feel like screaming into the pillow, any of those things. And so it is also an example here of being more in touch with our needs. And that's something so many of us can benefit from. So I do see a little bit of typing in the chat, but no actual comments have appeared yet. So we're just going to take a minute. Take a minute if anybody wants to add something to the chat. Yes. Okay. We have a great question here. So somebody is saying, can you explain how noticing our bodies during anger will tell us what we need? Example, I know when I get angry, my jaw tenses. Very relatable. Is the idea to just notice so you can release the anger from the body? What a great question. You're bringing in both of these points that we've been talking about. So the idea there is that if you are able to notice that anger in your jaw, one thing that you can do then is to just acknowledge that there is a need there. Like something about this was wrong. No wonder I need this. Um, I will just say to this person's comment, I think if you were to, or any of us, if we're experiencing jaw tension as an anger, as a form of anger, um, if you were to ignore that, so do the opposite of what we're doing, um, if you were to ignore it or you were to judge it. So this might look like saying, "Oh, I just need to think about something else," or saying like, "I can't believe my jaw is tight," or "I can't believe I'm stressed about this," or in some way minimizing your reaction or judging your reaction or trying to ignore what's going on. Then that anger might stay in you longer. So when you ask kind of what's the point? How would it tell us what we need? It might stay in us longer because on some level we're trying to ignore it or repress it. And it might come up later in terms of stress. So um, for example, I'm thinking about the person on the bus. I'm thinking about them kind of feeling the anger in some type of way. If you try to just ignore it, it might come out later in a situation that makes less sense. So it might be then you get home and you are really irritable and grumpy with the people in your house. So all of a sudden you are grumpy with your partner, you're yelling at somebody, um, and that would be less helpful because you're not correctly attributing it to why it came up in the first place. I'm wondering if that answers or speaks a little bit to that question a bit more. Because I think so often if we ignore anger, it actually comes out in different ways. And then all of a sudden it's about, in that example, if you end up grumpy with someone, well, it's not about them. It's about the situation on the bus. Your partner didn't do anything wrong. So that's just an example. I hope that made sense to that person or gave them something to think about. Jay, do you want to add something to that? Because we have a couple more things that we're going to get to. What do you
Yeah,
think?
no, I think your example of that really resonates with me. Especially with, I'm thinking back again to my example of burning my mouth yesterday and being in a rush and being late. And so in that moment, I didn't really have time to process my anger because I had to leave. And so by not processing that right away, or even just like noticing how that anger was coming up for me, when I got into the car and I was headed to where I was going, I ended up actually honking at someone because they were just a little too slow. Um,
Yeah.
and, I projected that anger that I had onto someone else when my anger was actually, from the situation that happened previously.
Mhm.
And so that's how it kind of came out on someone else. So I think it's very relatable in the sense that you're saying that sometimes your anger can come out in a different way or in a different situation that may not make as much sense because you're
Mhm.
already activated. Your system is already agitated. You're already annoyed. You're angry. You're frustrated. And instead of processing that yourself and taking a moment to actually notice what our anger is trying to tell us, we project it onto someone else.
Mhm. I'm so glad you mentioned that, Jay. Yeah, okay.
That poor person I honked at.
uh, um, okay, we have a couple more questions. I'm gonna read them out. Or we have two comments here, it seems. By all means, if people want to add things, we still have time, so please do that. All right, the next one, somebody contributed here. Often my first reaction preceding anger is defensiveness. Could you talk about how to deal with defensiveness before it becomes anger? Um, Jay, I already have a thought. Are you okay if
Yeah,
I go
go
with
for
that?
it. Go for it.
um, so to this person, I would just offer that maybe the defensiveness is already anger. Um, And so what you are in your example describing as defensiveness, to me, that's already angry. That's already the emotion of anger in the body. And then you say before preceding anger. My guess is that you just mean when the anger is actually coming out in your behaviors. So the anger started before it came out in your behaviors. So for example, say the behavior there is, being rude or speaking in a irritated way, and that's kind of the anger for you. Or maybe it's yelling, sure. Um, Something like that. I don't know. And you're talking about defensiveness before that. My sense is that the defensiveness is already anger, and we're just not used to maybe um, acknowledging it as such. And so it's kind of like in this example, we had only considered it anger once it came out in our behaviors, but it was anger before that already. Um, how to deal with defensiveness before it becomes anger. So I'm going to answer a different question then. And I'm going to say how to deal with anger before it becomes angry behavior. I hope that makes sense as a reframe of that question. So when we talk about dealing with the energy of anger before it becomes angry behavior that maybe those around us can detect or things like that. So I would say this involves taking a moment to acknowledge your inner experience with this defensiveness. Um, and again, seeing if you can do this in a neutral way. So it might be taking a moment out, seeing if you can pause your day or whatever's going on and say, there's something going on here for me. I can appreciate that there's something going on here for me. Something's bothering me. Something's bothering me. Something feels wrong to me. Something feels wrong to me. And starting there. And then talking about maybe a little bit what, again, if we're saying that this defensiveness is included under the umbrella of anger, noticing where you feel that defensiveness in your body. For me, it might be, again, I always have the tension right here between my eyebrows, or it could be fidgeting or tapping your toes or something like that. Just acknowledging that that's going on. I find that the sooner we acknowledge the experience, the less it grows. So kind of the sooner we can acknowledge it. Yeah. Okay. This person is coming up with another comment. I'm just going to answer this one in particular. The person who had talked a bit about defensiveness as anger is saying, it feels like panic to me usually. So if you experience this as panic, again, that's your body having a reaction to something. And panic, again, when we go back to the experience of trauma responses or responses to being triggered, that slide that Jay had posted.
Let me put it back up, actually.
Yes.
There we
Yeah.
go.
Yep. I'm wondering if this person could, with the help of a therapist or on their own, panic, when we talk about panic, it does fall somewhat under the fight response um, or the flight response because it's one of the high energy responses. So it's us experiencing a threat and actually having a lot of energy. Some of those things that we associate with panic, like rapid heart rate, fast heart rate, or fast breathing. If we think about our body trying to help us survive, those are things where our energy is increased. And so being able to explore those in terms of, I'm having a fight or flight reaction. And then exploring maybe, taking a bit of time to do some research on that or working through that with a therapist. If you're just going to get to therapy at some point in the future, thinking a bit about that being a goal that might be important to you is taking time with a therapist to explore that. So when I hear the word panic, I do think of um, a trauma response, just in terms of like a threat response. Your body's feeling some kind of threat in some way. I hope that that is a little bit helpful. I know that that question in particular might leave you with just more thoughts rather than fewer. I hope that you can just take whatever was helpful about that, or leave the rest if it wasn't enough. We have one more question here. So Jay, are you okay with that if I read one more question?
Yes, absolutely. I still can't see the chat, so
Okay.
go for it.
I just want to give the group a little bit of background that Jay and I were having a lot of tech issues. So we so appreciate your patience as a group as we've
Yes,
gone through this.
technology can be difficult sometimes.
Okay, so we have one more question here, and it looks like it's a comment, so I'm just going to read it out. Someone is posting, it's all right to feel anger or be angry. Practicing mindfulness allows us to be in the moment and be aware of what our thoughts and feelings are telling us. Anger becomes a negative energy when it's directed towards hurting or harming another creature, human being, or living creature. If we keep this locked up inside, it can harm us instead. Studies have shown that redirecting the energy to something that is calming, for example, yoga, Zen meditation, would be better than having it amplified. Example, smashing dishes. Albeit it can be satisfying, it does still not catalyze that energy, for example. So I want to just thank this person for that comment. It sounds like you have really reflected to us some of the things, and we're having a bit of a shared understanding here about it being okay to be angry. When you say the word mindfulness, that makes complete sense, because one of the tenets of mindfulness is non-judgment. So again, right back to what we've been doing with noticing the body in those terms that are not judgmental. What a great reminder of that. And the example that, you know, we're not talking about doing harm to others. We are talking about anger as an emotion or as an energy experience in the body. And it is different when we talk about how that anger sometimes, depending on the situation, leads people to harming others, even though that's not an excuse for that behavior. So thank you for sharing that comment. Any thoughts about that, Jay?
I think you explained so well before I can even get to it.
Um,
I do want to be a little bit mindful of the time. I was thinking, since we're already in this question and answer kind of part,
yes. Yeah.
we also want to know your feedback. At Heartwood, it's so important that we get feedback so we know what we're doing good, what we can improve on, what we need to do better. And so I'd encourage everyone to kind of just fill out this feedback form. So we have it in the form of a QR code, or I can also share the link in the chat. I'm not sure how to do that without not sharing my screen. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and try and find the chat that I can now see. Um, so I'm going to post the link um, just in the chat here. And if folks have a chance to fill it out and give us your impressions, um, maybe things that you're taking away from the webinar, what was helpful, maybe what was not so helpful, it will always help us kind of like improve on what we're doing, and learn to grow from that.
Mm-hmm. Jay,
So,
you were so totally successful. I see it there. So if everyone
yay!
can just click on that Survey Monkey link, I think it would hopefully open to a different tab, and then you can complete that at any time. Just like Jay said, we so appreciate your feedback. It helps us know, what was
Mhm.
good or what was not helpful. All of that, we love to hear it. So please do fill that out. And also, if for some reason you can't fill that out, um, please, you can also email us, or we can have
Mhm.
that link available at a different time if you don't get a chance to do it now. Just the
Yeah.
same email with the registration process. I think you would be attached to an email
I
there.
also want to kind of note that all of our webinars are recorded, and so
Mhm.
they will be posted on the Heartwood website. So if ever you want to like go back and see, maybe you want to jot something, we went too fast on something, you forgot to jot it down, or something that we said really resonated with you, you can always watch it after. I'm not exactly sure when it will be posted, but hopefully quite soon. So you can do some reflecting, and like the slides and everything will be posted there as well.
Mhm, mhm. So we're going to wait about 1 or 2 more minutes in case anybody wants to type anything in the chat. So we'll just hang out here for a moment yet. Um, and we want to thank you again just for taking some time out of your day to be with us and think a little bit about some new ideas pertaining to anger today. I'm seeing that some people are leaving the chat. So at this point, we're not saying anything new. Feel free to leave, and we'll just hang on for another moment. Okay, so it sounds like people are leaving the chat.
Yeah.
So what we are going to do is we're going to end the meeting here. So again, thank you for spending time with us this morning, and we were honored to share some of this with you, share this time.
All right, thanks everyone, have a good rest of your day.